Can you start that one as well, the red button? Are we recording? Okay, good evening everyone. We have a packed audience tonight. It's fantastic to see you all here. You're very welcome at Heriot Watt at our EdSign lecture. First one of 2015, second one really, in Heriot Watt here. To make you all aware, we will be live streaming Kyra's presentation tonight, but we will have a break for questions and answers at the end, which will not be live streamed. Okay, so if you do want to ask Kyra questions, you could submit questions through Twitter and Facebook, or you have to come to Edinburgh to see her in person, I'm afraid. Now, we have information about our future events. They're down at the front here. We have a list of the next events and also a poster for our next event in March. And these are both down at the front here. So pick one of these up if you're not already on our mailing list. The 3rd of March, our presenter will be Frankie McLean. On March the 3rd, he'll be talking about the future and of deaf services. So the information's here for you. Hopefully you're already on our Facebook list and our email list, so you're getting that information regularly. Now, when the presentation's finished here, you're free to go, but you should also know that the Signing Society very warmly welcomes you to the Student Union, where you continue on any conversations you want to have in sign language. If you're not sure where, then follow some of our students. We have Tommy here, you can follow him. He'll be headed to the pub, follow Tommy. Now, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kyra Pollitt, PhD. Kyra's recently completed her PhD. Many of you may know Kyra. She's also a very experienced interpreter and researcher. Her research tonight that she'll be talking about is sign language poetry and is the topic of her recent PhD thesis. So, over to you, Kyra. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My sign name is this, and my English name is Kyra Pollitt. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me along this evening, and thank you all for coming along also. Now, I'll be presenting in BSL, and my glamorous assistant and experienced interpreter, Yvonne Waddell, sign name, Yvonne, will be lending her voice to my English script. So non-deaf members of the audience will be hearing Yvonne's dulcet tones, but she will, for the most part, be speaking my words. And that's quite lucky tonight, actually, because I'm suffering from a cold. I have a bit of a sore throat. And with Yvonne's voice, I also have the local advantage of having a Glaswegian accent. So here's the topic of my presentation tonight. And before we begin, I'd just like to clarify some terms. I won't be talking tonight about written English poetry that's been translated into BSL. I won't be talking tonight about poetry that's been composed by a deaf person in English and then signed in BSL, although I do mention this briefly later. What I will be talking tonight about is a particularly creative form of communication found in deaf communities and which is composed and formed by deaf people in British Sign Language, which I'll abbreviate to BSL. Now, this creative form of communication also occurs in other natural sign languages, but my focus tonight will be on BSL. So let's begin by having a look at an example. I'd like to show you first a recording of Paul Scott performing Three Queens for the University of Bristol. Paul starts his performance with a brief introduction. And he tells the audience that the three queens of the title are English queens and that he hopes the audience will recognise them. And I'll briefly explain what happens next for the signing impaired amongst us. We are introduced to Queen Elizabeth I at her boudoir. She dresses, calls her attendants, and sets off on something like her daily rounds. In the course of these, she's introduced to potatoes, to tobacco, and finally, to sign language. We're then given a potted genealogy, where we briefly meet Queen Victoria, before we head to a treetop retreat in 1950s Kenya, where a young Princess Elizabeth is informed that she had succeeded to the throne. And then staying in Elizabeth II's reign, we witness the marches and demonstrations as pressure mounts for official recognition of BSL. Eventually, as the Cross of St George is raised on March the 18th, 2003, the first nominal recognition of BSL by the English Parliament, these three English queens stand shoulder to shoulder, looking through the long years of sign languages history. So when I asked Paul to talk about this recording, this poem, he told me the three queens reigned according to their bloodline. They didn't marry into the royal family. I wanted to highlight events that happened under their reigns. Queen Elizabeth, I recorded observing sign language in the UK in the 16th century. For Queen Victoria, some of her relatives were deaf. And for Queen Elizabeth II, her mother-in-law is deaf, and under her reign, our language, BSL, finally gained recognition in 2003. Also, her daughter-in-law, Princess Diana, launched our language in the public's eyes by learning to sign. She was patron of the British Deaf Association. So there's something interesting and revealing in tracing this thread through their collective reign. So let's have a look. Okay. So, what you've just seen would, in English, as I've written on the board, be called an example of sign language poetry. Can I ask the sign language users in the audience what sign you would use for this English word, poetry? What are your signs for that word? Okay, so we have poetry, poetry. Any others? Poetry. Same again. Just those two? We have another one? Maybe use both intermingly. That's all? One over in the far corner, same as before. Okay. So I'm going to be using two signs tonight because I want to begin to draw an important distinction. So for this term, sign language poetry, I'll sign this. Okay. But I'll also sometimes use another sign, which is this one. And the difference between the two signs should become clear as we go along. Now, I prefer this latter sign. It's borrowed from American Sign Language because it calls to mind a strand of thought on understanding the human artistic and creative capacity. It echoes James Hillman, so it links to James Hillman's notion of the thought of the heart, which draws on ancient Greek and also Arabic sources. They claim that the heart is an, James Hillman, as you'll see up here, they claim that the heart is an organ of the senses, like the eyes, the ears, the tongue, the skin, nose, that respond imaginatively to the world. Now, I won't go into the strengths and weaknesses of Hillman's work tonight, but it does bring to us the first question of tonight's talk. And that is, why is it important what we call it? Does it matter what sign we use or which English words we use? there are two reasons why it's important. What we call it influences other people's attitudes to it. And second, what we call it fixes our own understanding of it, what we know it to be. So let's spend some time looking at the first of these. We've all just watched Paul Scott's Three Queens. And what we call this in BSL or in English belies our philosophical perspective, our attitudes to deafness, deafhood, sign languages, and sign language communities. So I'm sure you're all aware of Dr. Paddy Ladd's defining work on deafhood. But in case you're not, we could roughly explain the difference here. As you see in this slide, Paddy Ladd's reference here to deafhood studies was a defining work in his field. If you're not aware of that, to roughly explain the difference here, if we suggest that deaf studies might denote a kind of looking from the outside in to deaf communities, whilst deafhood studies calls forth a perspective from inside deaf communities. Now, the English term sign language poetry comes from a concern with literature. Which in turn comes from a concern with language. And as we all know, it has been very important in the last 4 decades to establish that sign languages are real and natural languages. This is still important today. You only have to think of the BSL Scotland Bill that's currently making its way through the Scottish parliamentary process. The work of linguists in helping to establish facts about BSL has been and continues to be very positive and very important. Through their work, BSL can be seen to be every bit the equivalent of English. But when it comes to literature, and to poetry in particular, it all becomes a little bit like Cinderella's shoe. You all know that story? Think of the glass slipper as poetry. When Cinderella tries it on, it fits perfectly. But when anyone else tries it on, it just won't fit. So when we tell hearing people about sign language poetry, hearing people ask about ancient historical poets, they say, oh, is there a BSL person like Burns or Shakespeare? Well, there might have been, but we don't have any records. Can you quote their poems? We'll be asked. And we go, well, no, it doesn't really work like that. They might ask about the literary canon. They'll say, how can sign language poems rhyme? Well, that's easy. Matching hand shapes, locations, movements. They'll ask, are there romantic poets? We'll say, well, no, but there might be genres in other kind of ways. They'll say, is there haiku? And we'll say, well, sign languages are capable of haiku, but it's not a form that seems to occur naturally. Sign language poems tend to be more bardic. They ask then, where are the libraries that are full of sign language poetry? And we'll say, well, we're beginning to get DVD collections, but really the bardic tradition still persists. So you're more likely to see a poem performed more to mark an occasion, like a funeral, a wedding, a community event, Jerry Hughes' solo circumnavigation of the globe, that sort of thing. So there's a danger here that it can seem as if sign language poetry is almost as good as English, but not quite. And it's a bit of a shame. Or they think perhaps it's a new thing when it's not. They may think it's not really developed. Well, it's changing all the time, of course, but it's been around for a very long time. And of course, in the fairy story, everyone wants Cinderella's glass slipper to fit. We know in one version of the story, the ugly sisters even cut off their toes to try and make the shoe fit. So I think something similar happens when we try too hard to argue that sign language poetry has all the properties of written poetry, and that the literary practices and traditions we find around a language with no written form will exactly mirror those around written languages. But we could tie ourselves in knots trying to claim that everything in the signed world is the same as in the spoken written world. We have to be very careful what we tell ourselves. So here's an interesting story for you. For example, many of you will be familiar with the work of Dorothy Miles. Yeah, Dorothy was a deaf poet. She began working in written English, but later in life, after she learned sign language, she developed an interest in expressing herself creatively through sign language and began to be excited about the different possibilities, the different affordances, if we use Gunter Kress's term, creative sign language. And her work, therefore, encompasses two of the three types of sign language poetry that we identified earlier. At the beginning of her career, we see works that she herself composed in English and then translated into sign language. And finally, towards the end of her life, works that were composed and performed in BSL. Now, early in Dorothy's journey, back in 1975, the linguists of the Salk Institute in America had become interested in slips of the hand. And so we're looking at phonology and hand shape. They were working with volunteers from the National Theatre of the Deaf, one of whom was Dorothy Miles. Now, Carol Paddon and Tom Humphreys write that Dorothy Miles visited Ursula Bellucci and her colleagues at the Salk Institute, who were involved in a scientific exploration of signed language structure. Dorothy's interaction with the group inspired her So then, in a written preface to the poem Invocation, Dorothy herself writes, "This poem developed from a discussion about the similarity between the signs for shy, shame, and whore in ASL. When I finished writing it, I found that most of the signs I would use had the same hand shape." So since Dorothy began to perform her works at a time when VHS was beginning to allow sign language performances to be recorded, and at a time when television programmes, for deaf people had begun to embrace sign languages, Dorothy went on to become probably our most well-known modern sign language poet. And now, following her untimely death, her work has been analysed by linguists who have noticed this repetition of hand shapes in some of her poems and have decided this must be an important feature of all sign language poetry. And indeed, workshops aimed at encouraging new sign language poets insist they focus on repeated hand shapes. So you can see how things have come full circle. And the story just goes to show that in fact what we call it influences other people's attitudes to it, and what we call it fixes our own understanding of it, what we know it to be. So, what happens if we change what we think we know about this thing, sign language poetry? What if what we declare that what we saw Paul Scott do isn't just like English poetry? What if we say, we're not really that bothered about wearing glass slippers? Because what we do with our feet is already something altogether funkier. So that looks like a shoe, but on closer inspection, you see it's just a painting, painted directly onto the body, onto the naked foot. So if we took the view that sign language poetry, although obviously in many ways poetic, is actually a different kind of thing, then we wouldn't be alone in this view. Jim Cohn, in his 1999 publication, records an exchange that took place when an ASL poet met a famous American English poet. Robert Pernara, the deaf performer, said, "For deaf people, signing poetry is like painting pictures in the air." And Allen Ginsberg, the hearing beat poet, says, "Then a performance of poetry becomes another art form." Another art form. So let's say that Ginsberg is right, and a performance of sign language poetry is a different art form altogether. Then perhaps we could stop calling it sign language poetry for a moment and call it sign art. Can we now look at this art form with fresh eyes? And if so, what is this new art form and what can it do? Now, in my PhD thesis, I argue that sign language poetry is too restrictive a term. I argue that whilst this is undoubtedly poetic in nature, it's also so much more. It is another art form. It's sign art. So what are the differences between sign art and written or spoken poetry? In my PhD research, I found that sign art had additional features that written and spoken poetry doesn't have. Sign art is creative language, poetry, with drawing, hybrid image and line drawing, cinematics, dense image, gesture dance, composition, musicality, and social sculpture. And I won't have time to look at all these categories this evening, so I'll refer you back to my thesis for more detail, and I'll happily come back and talk about aspects that I can't cover tonight. But I will try to cover drawing. Number 1 on the slide, hybrid image and line drawing. And perhaps one of you might want to ask me a question about social sculpture or the other ones on the slide. But I think it's first important to clarify something about my research methodology, because here I am, a hearing researcher, so aren't I still working from the outside in? Aren't I simply changing a label? Well, to a certain extent, yes. However, my research practice was strongly influenced by the phenomenological turn that's current in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. That word, at the top. So a phenomenological approach that's been informed by authors, as you'll see, such as Edmund Husserl, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Michael Serres, seeks to appreciate the intermingled role of the human senses in negotiating and comprehending phenomena. And this type of approach can be found increasingly, for example, in human sensory geographies, and it's designed to allow a multiplicity of perspective. It seeks to limit the power of the outside in. And crucially, it begins with gathering different perspectives on the phenomena in question, rather than starting with the epistemologically determined suggestions of what should be there. Now, I'm not a native sign language user. Although fluent, I'm certainly not deaf, and I'm also not a practicing sign artist. So what did I do to engage in more phenomenological research? Well, go back. Okay. The first thing was to ask those who are deaf, those BSL sign artists. And this might seem simple and obvious, but despite all the years of research into sign language poetry in the UK, I was the first person to sit down with the sign artists themselves. When I sat down with the sign artists themselves, I asked them what it was they thought they were creating and how they went about creating it. I talked in depth to 4 practicing sign artists: Paul Scott, that you saw earlier in the film, Richard Carter, John Wilson, and Donna Williams. And they each mentioned the importance of language, of course, but for all of them, there was something even more important about their work, and that was the visual. And many of you will be familiar with the term visual vernacular, which many deaf people use to describe something that they feel lies a little beyond language. Three of the 4 sign artists talked about the importance of image in creating a work. They mentioned their interest or their previous training in visual arts and said that they used drawing as a tool to help them compose. So to test whether this was a phenomenon that was particular to a certain group of sign artists, I conducted a wee pilot study with a piece of work created by the Finnish sign artist and Associate Professor of Linguistics at Stockholm University, Johanna Mesh. And it transpired that Johanna is also a visual artist, and her creative process when it comes to making sign art also involves drawing. So I asked, could I see some drawings of her work? And this is the first image she sent. Now, those here tonight who are familiar with sign linguistics will probably identify this type of drawing as precisely the kind that you see in textbooks on sign languages and sign linguistics. Yeah? And when I mentioned this to Joanna, she responded by sending another image, one with an email, to say that she also had this kind of thing, but couldn't imagine that I'd possibly be interested in that. And this is Johanna's drawing of herself performing the work Ocean. And we see in this performance, the sign artist personifies the ocean, becoming sickened by pollution, signing, and I'll show you the example. So she personifies the ocean, becoming sickened by pollution. I then conducted Vox Pop, or more properly called, since they were in BSL, Manupop, interviews with sign language users who were attending sign art performances in Bristol and in Edinburgh. Again, strikingly, the audiences, unprompted, all commented on the importance of the visual qualities of a sign art performance. And this seemed intriguing, so I asked my original 4 sign artists to each select one of their works at random for analysis. Paul Scott's choice was 3 queens. So I'd now like you to look again at just the first 21 seconds of Paul Scott's 3 queens. And when you watch it this time, try to count how many BSL signs you think he uses. Okay, so I'll ask you at the end how many BSL signs you think he uses. So watch closely. Okay, that clear? Everyone ready? Okay. Forget the introduction, don't include that part, forget the introduction. Once he actually starts the poem. Now, and that's it. So we have 2, 1. How many do you count? 1? Anyone else? 1. 1 here. 1, 2. Only 1, 1 at the back. 2 here. One more. 1. Any more? Any advance on that? 2, 1, 2. Okay. So that's the problem with trying to talk about sign language poetry. As if it were only a phenomenon only of language. Because in fact, it seems to be more of a mixed phenomenon. One that can contain language, drawing, and even both simultaneously. But we'll come to that later. So I wondered, I'll go back to my slides. I wondered how best to test and analyse.
Sorry.
So I wanted to test and analyse this visual element of sign art. And I decided to trust this to another group of highly visual people, artists. And I established a collective of 15 non-signing professional artists. I deliberately selected artists who were working in all sorts of media. So from drawing painting, sculpture, ceramics, even wallpaper design and jewellery, with the hope that these different artists might unearth qualities of sign art that linguists might not, simply because they'd look at sign art through different, fresh eyes. So I sent each artist a video of one of the works that had been selected by my sign artists. And the sign artists had also provided a brief description of the work. You'll remember I read out Paul's earlier. So I translated these into written English and sent these brief descriptions to the artists with the work. And I simply asked the artists to respond to the video. They could choose whether they wanted to read this description first or not. And I asked them to keep a diary of whatever it was that they chose to do. And no further instruction was given. So, Edinburgh-based artist Sophia Lindsay Burns was given Paul Scott's Three Queens. And here's an extract from her diary and some examples of her response to that same opening 21 seconds that we've just seen. And you all identified only one or two BSL signs. So that was the same clip that Sophia looked at. And she said, I just started using a pencil. I put the Three Queens on and started following Paul's body. How he's moving determined where my pencil goes. I had to stop every time my hand didn't have the required time to follow Paul and start from where I'd left. I only managed to get to the scene where he starts eating or she starts eating. 5 drawings that result from my first visual intake or response to visual poetry. Paul inhabits the performance. His body is giving me the attitude of this queen. I can see her slowly emerging from the lines I'm setting on the paper. So from someone who had no awareness of sign language, Sophia was able to write this and draw. And if we were just looking at language here, Sophia wouldn't have been able to make these drawings. Remember that segment where the queen's eating? Up till that point, that was all she saw. That was it. And she made her visual response on paper to that. And I'll show you what she said, what she put on paper. With the headdress. So I'd like to remind you again that Sophia, the artist who responded to this and made these drawings, doesn't know any sign language. And if we were only looking at language here, she wouldn't have been able to make these drawings. And of course, you might claim that, well, she can make these drawings because of the highly iconic nature of sign languages. And in truth, there are more complex arguments to be made concerning, for example, Mary Brennan's work on iconicity and classifiers. Scott Liddell's movement hold analysis. And Christopher Miller's work on phonology, and so on. And I explored each of these in more depth in my thesis. Suffice to say here, however, that Paul Scott could have signed that whole section using everyday sign language. And if he had, it would not have looked like that, and Sophia would not have been able to respond in the way that she did. So Paul chose to deliver his sign art more visually. By using his body to create line drawings, which then Sophia found easy to simply trace. Yeah? And moreover, examples of this type were found in all 4 of the samples analysed. Now that is of interest. And it suggests that sign art is both a linguistic and a graphic activity. So at this point, I'd like to take you back to the comparison with written and spoken poetry. When I read a poem or I hear a poem spoken, the images I see are the images that I conjure in my own imagination. The words of the poet, they're not sufficiently precise to permit the image I conjure in my mind's eye to be exactly the same as that conjured by anyone else reading or listening to the same poem. And this is not quite the case with sign art. I mean, there is still some room for difference around the language that Paul Scott used in the fragment we watched. My colour red might differ from yours if we were ever able to test it. But the size and the shape of that pearl, the shape of Elizabeth I's headdress, the exact placement of her curls, these have all been carefully and exactly drawn for us by the sign artist. So like spoken and written poetry, sign art does have imagery, but unlike spoken written poetry, sign art also has image. Now, both deaf audiences at sign art performances and non-signers who were exposed to a rolling film of sign art performances every day for 1 week seem to agree. And I'll show you some of their comments. And I'll show you the deaf comments first. They said, the creativity of it is the story. Hearing poetry is created through English, like in book form, but deaf poetry isn't suitable for books. It's very different. So it is creative. Dot stuff is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but you can tell that it's been written. What we've seen tonight wasn't written. It's narrative, it's descriptive, it's not language. The flow as well. I like that piece where they move to the front of the stage, alternating in turn. It was like visual punctuation, pausing. It changed the light on their hands, and their facial expressions changed. You knew where, when, who, and there's something in that. And this is the responses from the hearing audience members. Well, this is some kind of art piece. It's always good to have something moving and interactive. Some form of expressive art, expressive dance. You did get that sort of sense of iconic. It looked like he was in a performance. So as my research progressed, I found it necessary to categorise the types of images that were being recognised in the sign art samples. And 3 types of image making emerged. Line drawing, dense image, cinematic, and I'll explain more about this in a moment. And thirdly, hybrid image. So we've seen examples of both line drawing and dense image in the first 21 seconds of the 3 Queens. Dense image engages the full body in a personification of a quality or entity. So like Queen Elizabeth calling forth her courtiers. Or Johanna Mesh's Ocean. And once embodied, these dense images can be more readily cinematically manipulated. So that is, they can be foregrounded, they can be backgrounded, they can be shown in the mid-shot, or extreme close-up. You can track from one side of the sign-in space to the other. You can have another image superimposed on them. Or superimpose themselves on another image. They can be speeded up, slowed down, and so on. So again, let's remind ourselves here how restricting it might be to label such an art form simply poetry. So the third point there, hybrid image, that's the one that really blows the mind. And this, it's when the linguistic and the artistic of sign art are effortlessly combined. And the most crisp example of this is linguistic property that I've come across. It's actually in a work by American sign artist. Debbie Rennie, and it's called Black Hole Colour ASL. Okay, and her work describes the barren experience, which is the black hole of the title, of the deaf child, before it's introduced to a natural sign language, which is colour ASL. Now, you'll find 100 different versions of this work on YouTube. Each of them created by enthusiastic sign language poetry students, but not a recording of a performance by Debbie Rennie herself. So in the live version I saw, Debbie demonstrated the liberation felt by the signing deaf child with a particular movement. I'll demonstrate this for you. Well, I'll try. Okay. Oh, it always gives me shivers. So in ASL, this handshake is used to denote the Roman alphabetic B. Okay? But it's also a handshake that can be used to denote a paintbrush of a particular size and shape. Okay? And the colour blue in ASL can be denoted by a sign which is located near the blue veins visible on the underside of the wrist. So the ASL sign for sky, unsurprisingly, indicates a region above the head of the signer. So in combination, however, Rennie's using elements of ASL as drawing materials. She's dipping the paintbrush of the alphabet into the lifeblood of her body and using that to colour a canopy under which she's going to perform the rest of the poem. She's quite literally painting with language. So the nearest, although less dynamic, equivalent we would have in written or spoken poetry is the pattern or concrete poem, where words can be arranged on a page to create an image. And here's an example. A bit blurry, I'm afraid, but see that there. So I'm afraid I don't have time tonight to talk to you about the other aspects of sign art that I identify in my thesis, although I'm happy to take questions about these. What I do hope to have demonstrated quite clearly tonight, though, is that it might be time for us to begin to break free of always explaining the deaf experience, deafhood, with reference to language. It remains, of course, extremely important to make sure the world understands that natural sign languages are real languages. And I cannot stress enough that sign art contains language elements that ally with traditional notions of the poetic. And for explanations of rhythm and other poetic features within BSL, I would direct you to the works of Dr. Rachel Sutton-Spence and Dr. Michiko Kaneko. Rachel Sutton-Spence has done an enormous amount of research on sign language poetry, and there's a lot of public works that you could look at, and also Michiko as well. There's a lot of research in those areas if you are interested more in that area. So if you're interested in the world being equal you can rest quite happily there with those references. But if you're open to the possibility that deaf people might offer something extra, something unique to the world, if you're open to the idea of deaf gain, and that there might just be something uniquely beautiful and wonderful about the deaf experience, then I also urge you to accept what deaf people consistently tell us and have always told us, that the deaf experience is one of heightened visual and kinesthetic sensibility, and that poetry composed and performed in a natural sign language both distills and reflects these uniquely enhanced sensibilities. Sign language poetry is not the same as spoken written poetry. It's a unique form of poetry, enhanced visually and kinesthetically. It is sign art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyra. That was just amazing, as always. I think what we're going to do now is just have a quick 5-10 minutes maximum comfort break. And then I know that Yvonne and Stacey have a quick announcement to make, and then we'll come back and ask Kyra lots and lots of really interesting questions, I'm sure. But just to remind you, we are going to stop the live stream now so that you can come up and ask questions with Gail around.
Before you guys take your break, yeah, we'll stop.